Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories of everyday people and their families. I endeavour to continue publishing episodes ad-free. In order to do so, I would love your support by reviewing my podcast or consider becoming a subscriber for only the cost of a coffee a month. This gives you early access to episodes and also access to bonus episodes, of which at this stage there's over 30. Episode 188, Patrick Coady Buckley. Part 2. The Irish American had the following statement about the Coady Buckley will case. Fact is stranger than fiction. A case in point has recently turned up in Kilkenny. Towards the close of the last century, the wife of Tobias Coady, having committed some offence in Dublin, was convicted and sentenced to transportation to Botany Bay. In those days, transportation to the Australian colony was literally served out for the most trivial offences, and hanging was greatly in fashion in the days of our great forefathers. Mrs. Coady was sent out amongst a consignment of convicts to Australia, and at the time of her conviction she had a male infant with her. Sometime after her arrival in the penal settlement, she was set at liberty in the colony on ticket of leave, and subsequently lived to the time of her death with a man named Buckley. Recently there, her son died intestate and unmarried in the colony of Victoria, leaving property to the amount of over £40,000. This man was the son of the female convict who was sent out from Dublin, and the question now is whether the legitimate son of Tobias Coady or the illegitimate son of Buckley. The Attorney-General of Victoria claims £40,000 for the government on the allegation that the deceased was the illegitimate son of Buckley. This is denied by several persons in the county of Kilkenny who claim to be relatives of the deceased, who they allege was the son of Tobias Coady and was brought to Australia by his mother on a convict ship. In this state of things, commissioners were appointed to take evidence in this country on the disputed point. They had already examined several witnesses in Kilkenny. They will take more evidence in Dublin, and a branch of the commission will be opened in Newfoundland. A considerable slice of the £40,000 will be spent in finding out who is the father of the deceased. There is no doubt the mother was a convict. People are usually not in a hurry to claim such relations, but £10,000 in the way makes us wonderfully solicitous to show our kinship, even if a deceased is of doubtful parentage. And that was on the 8th of February 1876. And in the New York Times on the 12th of March 1877, Romance of Convict Life, the will of a man born in jail. A fund of over $400,000 in dispute, transported to Australia, heirs to a rich stock breeder. Mr. Orpin's solicitor and John Galway's solicitor and Joseph Normall have been engaged during the past week in Dublin taking evidence by commission in an Australian case which is replete with features of romantic interest. The principal parties in the suit are the Attorney-General of Victoria and 9 claimants resident, one in Ireland and others in the United States, Canada and Newfoundland and elsewhere. The matter in dispute being between £80,000 and £90,000, left by one Patrick Coady, or Buckley, who it is alleged was born in the old jail of Newgate, Dublin on St Patrick's Day 1816 and died intestate in Australia on the 16th of June 1872. The Attorney-General claims on behalf of the Crown, as in the case of an illegitimate, and on the other side it is asserted that the deceased was born in wedlock and that the claimants, all people of humble circumstances, are his next of kin. The case of the latter, as sought to be established in evidence taken for the greater part before the present commission, is briefly as follows. In 1809, Eleanor Collins married Tobias Coady. They were servants in families then resident in Mountjoy Square, Dublin. Some years later, in September 1815, Mrs. Coady committed a theft of a plate, the property of her employer, Mr. M. Sweetman, and being convicted was sentenced to 7 years' transportation. Early in 1816, she, while awaiting the vessel to convey her, together with other convicts, to Cork en route to New South Wales, gave birth to the interstate man, who was baptised and christened Patrick in the Roman Catholic Chapel of St Michan's, which has an entrance directly opposite to the old Newgate. In the following year, the mother and son were shipped to the penal settlements where, on the expiration of her term of imprisonment, the former got the run of the colony and married a free convict named Edmund Buckley, from whom the interstate took his second surname. Whether this second union was bigamous does not appear, but this is certain, that both Mrs. Coady or Buckley and her son prospered in their new home. The former died at a ripe old age, and despite the conviction, her memory is established in poetry and prose in an elaborate, monumented tablet in the Roman Catholic Cathedral of Sydney, while the son, having been one of the earliest squatters in Gippsland, realised an immense fortune and was esteemed alike for his open-handed liberality and rectitude of character. On the demise of Patrick, and when it was found that he left a will, search was made for the next of kin. In this inquiry, but little information was obtained, owing largely, it is stated, to the fact that with the connivance of the authorities, all of the records of the penal times, the arrival of convicts, had been destroyed on account of their displaying the origin of families now risen to eminence and opulence. But while this investigation was pending, 2 suits were instituted on the estate of the interstate. The first was by 2 creditors for small amounts, who proceeded by a bill in Chancery to administer, and the second was in the Court of Probate by one named Thomas Marr, who alleged that the deceased had made a will in his favour so far back as 1848. The Attorney-General intervened as representing the Crown, and after a trial lasting 10 days in the Supreme Court in Melbourne, the will was pronounced a forgery, and Marr, who set it up, was sent to jail to await his trial for having made or procured the making of it, and died in prison in May 1874. Meanwhile, Mr. Octavius O'Brien, solicitor of Dublin, having been communicated with by Australian agents, instituted inquiries at home and abroad, and in the result the present claimants were discovered. To establish their rights, evidence has been taken by a commission in America, Newfoundland and Kilkenny to trace the family genealogy of the claimants, and now lastly in Dublin, prior to the final trial, which will adjust the rights of the parties. The Attorney-General does not admit that the interstate was the child born in Newgate in 1816, and to establish this fact and trace the history of that child was the object of the present inquiry. Among the evidence given by the following, Reverend Paul Kebo, CC St Michan's, produced the registry of baptisms of that parish for 1816, and under the date of March 16 appears the entry of Patrick Coady, son of Tobias and Eleanor Coady. The 2 registries of birth and baptism were produced as authentic and solemn. Mr. George Frith Barry, Chief Clerk in the State of the Paper Office in Record Tower, Dublin Castle, attended with a number of documents and letters relating to the shipments in 1817 of convicts from Cork to New South Wales, and in the list appears the name of Eleanor Coady, but among the copy letters was one from Sir Robert Peel, the Chief Secretary of Ireland, to the effect that the children of convicts could not, without the permission of the Colonial Office, be permitted to accompany their mothers, and another from the Commodore of the convoy with the convict ships, intimating that, in the absence of orders to the contrary, he'd been obliged to land a number of children at the Cove of Cork, their mothers creating such a scene on board, in which one was Mrs. Coady. 12 children went out on board. There are also papers found of Patrick Coady Buckley's, which has evidence that Toby Coady, who married Eleanor Collins, was from Kilkenny. The only relative of the deceased lived in Ireland, a cousin from that city. It stated that Mr. Coady Buckley was a warm-hearted and liberal man in the colony and gave large sums to charity, and his capital was created through the sale of cattle. On the 13th of September 1884, in the Hamilton Spectator in Victoria, the article is titled "A Squandered Estate." In 1843, there went to reside in Gippsland an unpretentious young man whose name, through the peculiar conjunction of circumstances after his death some 30 years later, was destined to become known throughout the Australian colonies as well as England and America. Everything surrounding the previous history of this young man seemed to be more usually obscure, as no one knew who he was or where he came from. Some doubt extended even in his own mind as to his name, as he styled himself indifferently as Patrick Coady and Patrick Coady Buckley. He was possessed of an extraordinary amount of energy and perseverance, the effects of which were soon seen in this wild locality which he chose for his home. He was unmarried and apparently destitute of family connections, a fact which assumed special significance during the later years. As to his early history, the only facts that can be gathered from the records in the courts in which his estate was principally sunk, young Buckley lived with Edmund Buckley in Windsor, New South Wales and in Sydney, and adopted the name which in later years led to much confusion. In 1832, the 3 parties moved to the Monero district, where Buckley Sr. became the owner of certain stations and cattle. Coady's mother died in 1836, but in spite of severing the link which bound him to his adopted son, Edmund continued to employ Patrick, who ultimately acquired the possession of a few cattle. Kindly relations seemed to exist for 6 or 7 years, but the restless energy which characterised the career of Coady Buckley some years later could not submit to the restraints imposed by the older man. A serious quarrel took place, in the course of which Edmund Buckley told Coady that he had no right to the name of Buckley. Possibly this was the first occasion on which Coady had been apprised of the fact, and it seemed very probable that the real relationship between the putative father and mother of his youth had been suppressed, at any rate till after the death of the female. Considering that the child was very young when the unhallowed connection between Mrs. Coady and Edmund Buckley was formed, it was quite natural to infer that they disguised the true position to the child, and this induced him to believe that Buckley was his father. No doubt at this time Edmund Buckley was in a fairly prosperous condition, but young Coady, in a state of indignation at the imposture, and this seems to be the only explanation, and relying upon his own talents, chose to fling himself upon the world rather than stay with the man who made his early life a lie. After the separation, he went to live with some people in the neighbourhood, and after worrying about his real name for some time, he determined to adopt the name of Patrick Coady Buckley. After staying with his friends for some time, he determined to visit Victoria, and accordingly left them and settled at Gippsland, or Prospect, as it was known then, Merriman's Creek. There he took up a pastoral run in 1843. At this time the blacks were very troublesome in the district. He at once took very stringent measures against the natives, so that in a remarkably short period he had struck such terror into them by his pluck and energy that they left him unmolested. From the very first, every speculation he entered into proved successful, and after a year or two he was enabled to purchase other stations in North Gippsland. During the whole of the time in which he was accumulating a large mass of wealth, which he left behind him, he showed himself to be a reserved and almost taciturn man, though not without polish, but he was always most liberal in the cause of charity. He was nominally a member of the Roman Catholic Church, but he never showed himself to be a strict adherent to the dogma of the faith. In Gippsland he lived an unassuming, quiet life, the details of which are known only to his immediate neighbours. To the general public his name became notorious after his death, owing to the legal complications which arose in connection with the estates. After a life of energy, toil and privation, Patrick Coady Buckley died on the 16th of June 1872, and shortly after his death his estate fell into the hands of his lawyers, and then began a desperate legal game which was only terminated quite recently, which left little more than a wreck of the property behind. The deceased, we've pointed out, appeared to be completely severed from his relations, who no doubt imagined that he died in poverty in one of the back blocks, and the result was that no relative claimed the estate. The curator of the interstate estate stepped into the breach, but it was thwarted in an unexpected manner. A portion of Buckley's estate was mortgaged for £6,000 to Peter Stuckey, whose trustees sought to obtain administration as creditors. The curator would not abandon the position he'd taken up, and he commenced an extraordinary series of actions which diminished the value of the estate, though at the same time kept it prominently before the world. For more than 10 years, from August 1872, the curators met in the Equity Court. The estate was kept seesawing between the Equity Court and the Full Court, the variety of aspects in which matters were presented speaking volumes for the ingenuity of the legal advisers of various parties. On the 15th of August 1872, the curator succeeded in obtaining a rule for administration, and as the mortgage debt was not due, they had perfectly good security for the money. The defeated party appealed in the Full Court, which upset Mr. Justice Molesworth's decision and affirmed the right of the curators to administration. The curators were confident that the decision was wrong, but as an officer of the court he felt himself debarred from challenging the judgment of that court by appealing to the Privy Council, though in a majority of instances Mr. Justice Molesworth's opinion had been adopted by the Privy Council in preferences to that of the Full Court where the two bodies clashed. The curator being defeated, he withdrew from the scene. They were not, however, left in undisturbed possession long, for the housekeeper of Buckley, Miss Eliza Ricketts, claimed £4,000, the claim being based on a cheque for that amount enclosed in a letter written by Buckley in which he said he would leave her that sum, in recognition of her true and virtuous conduct during the last 25 years. The claim was submitted to the court and Miss Ricketts obtained a verdict, though not for the full amount. The administrators were also attacked by an old man named Thomas Marr, who produced a will purporting to have been signed by Buckley on the 10th of March 1843. After some hesitation, the curators determined to dispute the will as being a forgery, and the matter came before Mr. Justice Molesworth in March 1874. Marr valued the gross property at £63,000 and gave a detailed description of the circumstances under which the will was executed. He said he was intimate with the Buckleys when they were in Sydney and accompanied them to Monero. On the date of the will, Buckley, John Hennessy and James Carroll went to Marr's house, and Buckley said he wished to make his will, being apprehensive of the violence of the blacks in Gippsland, where he was going. The will was drawn up and executed, the only person present other than those mentioned being a workman named John Nicol. The will was left with Marr for safekeeping, and Nicol stated that on one occasion when Marr was away from home in 1844 or 1845, a great flood covered the floor of the house and moistened the will. Marr and Nicol were the only survivors of the parties who saw the will executed, and Nicol corroborated the story with Marr. There was, however, a strong vein of improbability running through the narrative, and Mr. Justice Molesworth refused probate to the document. Acting upon this decision, the authorities caused Marr to be arrested on a charge of perjury, but before he was brought to trial, he died. The next step of the development of this litigious history was the filing of a bill in equity against the curators by the Attorney-General, the object of which was to ascertain that if there was any of Buckley's next of kin surviving, failing which the Crown would claim the estate. On the 1st of June 1874, a decree was made directing the Master to inquire to the next of kin. This caused advertisements to be inserted in newspapers in the Australian colonies, in Great Britain and America, desiring those claiming to be the next of kin of Patrick Coady Buckley to bring forward proof of their relationship. The replies were of most extraordinary character. For instance, it stated on good authority that one gentleman in England wrote to the Secretary of State for the Colonies stating that his servant was named Buckley and was next of kin to the deceased, and requested the Secretary to forward the money by return of post. Amongst others, Lord Henniker of Thornham Hull, Ireland, also appealed on behalf of a servant named Buckley. After a lot of trouble, the Master found that the following persons were first cousins and next of kin: Mary Coady, wife of John Coady of Kilkenny, Ireland, carpenter; James Marr and Thomas Marr of New York; Ellen Tobin, wife of John Tobin of Newfoundland; Mary Grace of Newark, United States; Edward Grace of the same place; Patrick Coady of Newfoundland; Catherine Brown, wife of Hugh Brown of Nova Scotia; Bridget Murphy, wife of Edmund Murphy of Benalla. On the Master reporting these people as the next of kin, the Attorney-General withdrew from the suit, and the next of kin then fought it out with administrators on the question of costs. It appeared that irrespectively of this suit, the administrators had paid £5,400 in costs. The curator's case was terminated last year. The expenses of the suit were excessively heavy and may be seen from the following items paid out to the estate to different solicitors. The balance was distributed amongst the next of kin last year at the total amount of £20,502, representing the poor remnant that was left of the estate, valued in gross 10 years before as £63,000. In the Sydney Smith's Weekly on the 7th of September 1929, squatters' money held for 57 years. Sensational attempt to secure Gippsland estate. Ink test upsets forged will. Australia, though still a very young country, has had its quota of remarkable will cases, but it's doubtful if any country in the world during the past century has staged more a sensational series of extraordinary events than those surrounding the affairs of Patrick Coady Buckley, who died in Gippsland in 1872, leaving real and personal estate worth over £100,000. Although there have been many claimants to the fortune, no rightful heir has been discovered to this day, despite that there are citizens now living in Victoria who allege they are relatives of either the Buckleys or the Coadys. Recently, word was received from England that a brand new set of claimants are contemplating legal action to recover the fortune. If the matter reaches the courts, it will give publicity to one of the strangest will stories in history, and it outlines the reasoning behind the quarrel between Edmund Buckley and Patrick Buckley in this article. It says in about 1840, a bitter quarrel occurred between Buckley Sr. and young Pat. The former met him on the station, horsewhip in hand, and accused him of mating his prize bulls with Patrick's cows. Edmund had waited until Patrick's cows had calved, and the old man identified the calves by peculiar markings. A priest was called in to intervene, and the two agreed to go their separate ways in the future. The young man was then to be known as Patrick Coady Buckley. The elder man had complained to the priest that Pat had no claim to the name of Buckley. Paddy, as he was previously known, went to live with friends, the Mars, 12 miles out of Monaro. So in this article, it also is a lot clearer as to what Thomas Marr was claiming. So it says that the curator of interstate estates claimed the fortune, and matters lay dormant until 1874, with like a bolt from the blue, Thomas Marr, an old friend from the Monaro district in New South Wales, produced a long-lost, much faded and worn will, dated 1843, in which P.C. Buckley bequeathed the whole of his fortune, less a grant of £500 to St Mary's Roman Catholic Church, Sydney, to Marr and his wife. Marr claimed the lot as his wife had predeceased him some years earlier. Eventually, this was impounded as a forgery. Marr's story was that Pat Buckley returned to Monaro in 1843 in fear of his life. 2 friends of Buckley's had been murdered by wild blacks close to the station, and Aborigines had also threatened him. He was in fear of his death daily, and his mission was to make a will in favour of his old friend Marr and his wife Eliza Ryan. Accordingly, they mustered some witnesses in a hut one evening, and with the assistance of an amateur lawyer, James Hennessy, the will was duly drawn, signed and witnessed by Carroll, O'Farrell, Edmonds and a convict servant named Nichols, all of whom had since departed this life. The will produced in court had the appearance of age, and it showed signs of having been through fire and flood. He stated that when Buckley handed him the will, he locked it away in a wooden box. A few years afterwards, in 1845, a great flood occurred, and the box containing the precious document was carried downstream and subsequently retrieved, and the papers were soaking wet. Marr's wife dried the wet ink and ironed out the will with an ordinary flat iron, and after that Marr always carried the deed about his person until 1864. In that year, he rescued a child from the creek in Jingira, and before doing so, he gave his coat and belt to a friend named Peter Curley to mind. After the rescue, he accompanied the girl to Malonga Gully and did not return to Curley's hut for 3 days. When he arrived at Peter's place, Peter had left, taking with him Marr's coat containing Patrick Coady Buckley's will. He did not communicate with Buckley in Gippsland because he always thought that Curley would one day return the will to him. He never set eyes on Curley again, but a year or so after Buckley's death, Curley is alleged to have sent a stranger to the house of a friend of Marr's with the long-lost document. However, bad spelling and the wrong kind of ink was the undoing of Marr's amazing story. Old-time documents prove that Carroll, an ex-policeman whose signature was on the will, always signed his government pay sheet, Kevil. Handwriting experts refused to accept the signatures of Buckley's, although they were definite in the opinion that Marr did not attach it. But the great showdown came by testing the ink. In 1843, all the inks were composed of gall, and some 20 years later, a substance known as logwood was used. Hydrochloric acid tests applied to the ink on the document turned the writing into a bright scarlet colour, whereas the acid test on gall ink produced a pale yellow tint. It was proved that the will was only a few years old. The document had been dipped in muddy water, dried and ironed, and even the paper used had a recent watermark in its composition. Justice Molesworth found that the will was a forgery, and Thomas Marr was ordered to stand his trial for perjury and forgery. He died in Melbourne jail awaiting trial, but in the last hours he confessed his sins. The enormous amount of publicity given the case aroused interest throughout the world. Claimants appeared above the horizon like bidders at bargain sales. Citizens of London, Dublin, Kilkenny, America and Canada made bids for the fortune throughout the 1880s and 1890s, only to fail through want of sufficient proof. One brave New York dame named Coady made a daring claim for the money. She alleged that her husband, Patrick Coady, left her and went to Australia and died there in 1872. Her lawyers sought special leave to contest the case against the curator, but it subsequently turned out that her late husband's name was Coady, and that the only time he was known as Coady was when he gave that spelling to the New York police on being charged with an offence. The recent information concerning a set of claimants is interesting, and then should they obtain leave for a trial in Australia and are successful, then the consolidated revenue account will have a very weak appearance for many years to come. In itself, 57 years of interest on £100,000 amounts to a tidy sum. And on the 13th of January 1930, in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, heirs to a fortune are found, 3 sons of rich man's relative. As a result of inquiries at Benalla today, relatives have been traced of the late Patrick Coady Buckley, to whom an American relative left £20,000. Mrs. Bridget Murphy, a relative of Buckley, died at Benalla in 1889, aged 65. She had a family of 6 sons and 1 girl, but only 3 sons are alive. Dominic at Benalla, Frank at Bismuth, New South Wales, and Peter in Queensland. Relatives have been unable to locate Peter, who's on an outback station. And on the 13th of January 1930, beat Patrick Coady Buckley in race, Caulfield woman's memory. A kindly, honest squatter is how Mrs. L. Wells of Carnarvon Street, Caulfield, today described the late Mr. Patrick Coady Buckley of Prospect Station, Gippsland, the relatives of whom are being sought by an American firm to share in £20,000 left by an American kinsman. When I was 12 years old, said Miss Wells, I ran the late Mr. Buckley a race at a picnic and I won. He was a good man. Inquiries by the Herald have traced Mr. Dominic Murphy, a son of the late Mrs. Bridget Murphy of Benalla, a cousin of the late Mr. Buckley, and one of the beneficiaries under the estate. Mr. Murphy lives at Benalla. And on the 13th of January 1930, in the Melbourne Sun News pictorial, Mrs. Bridget Murphy came to Australia from Kilkenny Island between 1851 and 1852 and lived at Geelong and Winchelsea for some years before coming to Benalla. Yesterday, Dominic Murphy said that when Patrick Coady Buckley died, his mother received about £5,000 from the estate. He had the documents verifying the legacy and the enlarged photograph of Patrick Buckley. And 18th of January 1930 in the Melbourne Weekly Times, search for woman to share fortune. Where is Mrs. Bridget Murphy of Benalla? Bridget Murphy, wife of Edward Murphy, who was living at Benalla in 1882, if still alive, will probably share in the sum of more than £20,000 left by an American relative of the late Patrick Coady Buckley, former of Prospect Station, near 90 Mile Beach, Gippsland. If Mrs. Murphy is dead, then her children, if she has any, may have a chance of claiming the money. Inquiries of Benalla failed to trace Bridget Murphy or her children. The New York solicitors have asked Lloyd's of Melbourne to trace relatives of Buckley. They did not state the actual sum awaiting distribution. They merely said it was more than £20,000, which is about as much as what ultimately was distributed from the estate of Patrick Buckley. The solicitors also did not reveal the name of the person by whom the money was left. Bridget Murphy of Benalla was one of the 9 first cousins of Buckley who shared £20,500, all that was left of the will of Buckley's £63,000 estate, after 10 years of litigation and worldwide interest. Mrs. Murphy was the only beneficiary living in Australia. The failure of the New York solicitor to provide full particulars will delay the work of Lloyd's. Until it is known who left the money, it will be impossible, assuming that a claimant is found, to give power of attorney. A request has been sent to America for all the facts. Meanwhile, Lloyd's will begin a search of the official documents concerning the Buckley estate. And on the 5th of February 1930, in the Port Pirie Recorder, tracing the Murphys' American inheritance. 4 people who are believed to be claimants to the sum of £20,000 left by an American relative of Patrick Coady Buckley have been traced to Lloyd's Melbourne. Lloyd's Melbourne, who are acting under instructions contained in a hastily written letter received from a firm of New York solicitors, have ascertained that Mrs. Murphy left 7 children, 4 of whom are now alive. Walter Patrick, Edmund James and Elena Mary are dead. Lloyd's have ascertained that Thomas Joseph, Francis Michael, Peter and Dominic David are still alive. Peter's last address was Claremont via Rockhampton in Queensland. He is said to be of a roving disposition, a drover and sheep station worker, but Lloyd's anticipate no trouble in locating him. Thomas Joseph has not been heard of since just before the war, but is believed to be still alive. Dominic David is living in Benalla, and Francis Michael, who is commonly known as Frank, is in New South Wales. Apart from their efforts to trace the Murphys, Lloyd's have received a score or so of letters from people who claim to be relatives of Buckley or Coady, or state that they have an uncle or aunt of that name. None of these is believed to have any legal claim on the money. And on the 12th of February 1930, and in the Melbourne Australiasian on the 15th of February 1930, The Coady Buckley Fortune, written by J.M. of Wonboyne, New South Wales. In the Australiasian on February the 1st, appeared a reply to J.C. Balladoo, Western Australia, relating to the Coady Buckley fortune and the beneficiaries under the will of Patrick Coady Buckley. Much has been spoken and written about Patrick Coady Buckley, that he had great organising ability. In 1851-1852, I lived with my father and mother at Lake Tyers in Gippsland. We had as neighbours several hundreds of Aborigines. Mr. Buckley was our nearest white neighbour, 30 miles distant. He used to ride to our abode very often, as he claimed to come from the Queen's County Island, my mother's birthplace. If he was not a native of that particular part of Ireland, he certainly had a wonderful knowledge of it, for he spoke of people and places with a familiarity that apparently only a person actually belonging to the place could possess. My parents spoke of him as a highly interesting man and one possessed of a rich sense of humour and general knowledge. Mr. Buckley died interstate, and it was a long time before the heirs to his property could be found. I believe the estate was eventually divided amongst 4 persons, one of them being a 17-year-old girl, until then as poor as a grey magpie. Now there is another case in the person of Patrick Coady, who is stated to have died in the United States and left £20,000 to his kith and kin in Australia. The Australian Buckley's father's name was simply Patrick Buckley and his mother's maiden name Mary Coady, hence the inclusion of Coady in the son's name. So who was Bridget Coady, or Bridget Murphy? Bridget Coady was born in August 1828 in Gowran, Kilkenny, Ireland, and she was the daughter of Patrick Coady and Mary Whelan. She emigrated to Victoria and arrived in Geelong on the 21st of June 1854. She married Edmund Murphy in 1859 when she was 31 and Edmund 20. Mentions that Edmund Murphy was greatly interested in mining, and amongst many of the properties he owned at the Reef Hills were the Lion and Golden Queen, from which he obtained good yields. They had 7 children together, and as mentioned, Bridget died on the 29th of May 1899 in Benalla, and leaving her 4 surviving children. The death notice says Mrs. Bridget Murphy, wife of Edmund Murphy, one of Benella's oldest inhabitants, died at an early hour on Monday morning, the cause of death being an affliction of the kidneys, from which the deceased had had for a long time. She was 65. She was the native of Kilkenny, Ireland, arrived in Victoria in 1855, marrying her husband, from whom death had separated her some years afterwards, and settled near Geelong, but finally took up her abode with her husband in Benalla, where she resided up to the time of her demise. The late Mrs. Murphy was a woman of many Christian parts, for besides being a faithful wife and self-sacrificing mother, she was kind and amiable in her disposition. As a result, she was widely esteemed, especially amongst our old identities, to whom she was, of course, best known through her lengthy residence in the district. So the first child, Peter, was born in 1872 in Winchelsea, Victoria, and he died in 1938 in Parramatta at the age of 66. And his death notice in the paper says Mr. Peter Murphy. Mr. D.D. Murphy of Benalla West received word last Monday that his brother Peter had died at Parramatta last Sunday. He left Benalla many years ago and went to Queensland, where he resided till a short time ago. He served in the Great War with the Queensland Regiment, and whilst in Belgium was wounded and gassed. He went to England for treatment but never recovered thoroughly from the effects of the gassing. He was invalided back to Queensland and remained there until recently, and then he went to Sydney for treatment, but he never recovered from the effects of gas and died last Sunday morning. The deceased will be remembered by some of his old schoolmates who are still residing in the district. The second child was Thomas Joseph, born in 1866. He, with his brother Frank, were interested in wolfram mining at Deepwater in New South Wales, and that was in 1912. Third child, Dominic David, was born in 1871 in Winchelsea. He married Charlotte Loftus Willis in July 1907 when he was 36 and Charlotte 23. They had 4 children. Dominic was a butcher until 1906 and then was a pound keeper at Benalla, and he died at Wangaratta in 1944 at the age of 73. The fourth boy, Francis Michael, he was born in 1872 and died on the 14th of July 1938 at Glen Innes, New South Wales, aged 66. And in the articles trying to track them down, it said that Peter's last address was Claremont via Rockhampton in Queensland, and that he was a drover and sheep station worker. So the very interesting story of Patrick Coady Buckley, claims to his will, but also further money coming through to descendants of this family from America.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch.